The Business of Biotech is produced by Life Science Connect and its community of learning, solving, and sourcing resources for biopharma decision makers. If you're working on biologics process development and manufacturing challenges, you need to swing by bioprocessonline.com. If you're trying to stay ahead of the cell or gene therapy curve, visit cellandgene.com. When it's time to map out your clinical course, let clinicalleader.com help. And if optimizing outsourcing decisions is what you're after, check out outsourcepharma.com. We're Life Science Connect, and we're here to help. In my ongoing talks with the leaders of new and emerging biopharma companies, both on the record and off the record, I hear a common refrain about the travails of cash management in an industry where the cost of doing business with other people's money is incredibly high and where spending can easily outpace development time and regulatory rigors. Those stakes are raised even further during the foray into clinical trials, where cash burn rates accelerate and the future funding picture, or lack thereof, comes into sharp focus. On today's episode of the Business of Biotech, we're zeroing in on resource allocation and cash management fundamentals with our favorite biotech finance management maven, none other than Allan Shaw. Allan, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Matt. Really great to be back here, and look forward to talking about the topic du jour.
Yeah, as do I. This is something that just keeps on coming up in more and more conversations I'm having. And it's enlightening as sort of someone looking into, the four walls. It's enlightening just how transparent some biotech leaders have been with me about their, lack of prescriptive knowledge, if you will, around cash management at different phases of their, new and emerging biopharma business. So I thought, boy, that would be a good topic to talk over with my old buddy Allan, because he's been down that road many, many times. So here we are. But before we jump into it, is summer going well for you? Enjoying the summertime?
Absolutely. Like always, it's going a little too fast, but certainly been enjoying the weather when the weather permits, and looking forward to the second half of it as we move forward. Same here.
I'm we need to look at the second half. I need to get out there and cast a line with you.
Anytime. Let me know.
We'll make it happen. So here's where I want to start. I want to start with some reflections from you on just some of the sound bites that I've heard in these conversations with emerging biotech founders and CEOs. One in particular. So I recently, just last week, I had this conversation, a very colorful conversation with an unnamed veteran biotech COO, Chief Operations Officer, who's worked in both big bio and emerging bio, and his company is in a dramatic place right now. He's the CEO of a company that is winding down. It ran out of money. This was an off the record conversation. He was very frank with me about the how and why. For the wind down. They ran out of money. So I want to run some of his truths, and I say truths in air quotes, things that he believes to be true, past you. And I want to kind of get your take on each one of them and maybe wrap a nugget of actionable advice around some of these if you can. So the first, and some of these, they sound pretty general, but I want to dig into them. So the first thing that I noted that he said was that scientist founders specifically, often waste money because they lack business acumen. To me, I'm like, well, that's a sweeping generalization, but I can see where, perhaps in some cases it might be true. What say you?
It's funny because, the cash management really starts at the top, right? And I think it really comes down to your priorities and your focus. And, it's a natural backlash from where we just came from, where the money spigot was wide open. And, because the cost of capital was so low, people didn't have to make hard decisions because they could do everything. It was about that simple. And now that the spigot is drying up, it's really critical to kind of refine your focus and be smart about some of your priorities. And I think when you could do everything, you didn't have to be focused, and you didn't necessarily have to have priorities. and you didn't necessarily have to collaborate. So now it's an environment where you need to do more with less. So it starts actually at the top, as opposed to the bean counters, or the back office. I think it really looks at, a lot of times now, I think people's eyes are bigger than their bellies, and they're trying to do a lot more than they really should be doing. And so I think part of it is this kind of, I guess it's akin to trying to put somebody in a who's a size 20 into a size 10. It's not going to look right. You need to kind of go on a diet. You need to kind of make that work, and I guess really be in touch with both your masculine side and your feminine side. Yeah. All right.
Elaborate on that a little, the masculine feminine side kind of analogy. Clarify that for me.
Sure. Happy to further elucidate. I think, everyone has their aspirations, right? But you also have to be in touch with what's practical and what's realistic in this environment. You can't necessarily do everything at once. You can't necessarily run all the studies that you want to run. You just got to understand what your limitations are and understand who you are, I think is the bottom line. And, before, when the punch bowl was out, it was a lot easier because you could do everything. Now the bar has been raised. The market has become a lot more discriminant. And you can't just raise money. You need to bridge yourself to another place, to another data set, to another inflection point. Mm-hmm. And that's an adjustment. And if you're going, if you're going on a long drive, and everything that's in drug development is a long drive, you need to make sure that you've got enough gas to get to the next gas station. And maybe you don't drive as fast. Maybe you take a shorter trip. You've got to learn to work with what you have and learn to do more with less.
It sounds like a marvelously simplistic to me, like a simple problem to cause, but a simple problem to solve. So I'm gonna throw another one of these quotes. It's kind of segues into where I want to go next with the conversation. Another quote, this guy said, early stage biotechs often spend unnecessarily because they don't scrupulously budget the way a mature established company does. They're too fast and loose with their newly found indiscriminate buckets of cash. And he talked about, in a lot of those environments, there not being, I guess, discretionary kind of buckets or silos of money for specific activities, but more sort of like a cash grab once the Series A or Series B, as it were, is in the coffers. Is that true? I mean, do you see, like, in new and emerging biotech, do you see situations where, like, there's literally sort of a lack of boundaries or around budget lines?
I would say I guess to be clear, not typically.
Okay, good. Yeah.
I don't.
Well, that's a relief.
Yeah, I mean, I typically, you wouldn't see that. I was trying to look for the right way to kind of express myself on that. But typically you have a plan. I mean, investors will want to know what is the objectives of the Series C, right? You're funding yourself to a certain point. I think what gets caught up in what was said is that I have seen and I've written and observed that people, when they have more, they're just less disciplined. Mm-hmm. I think, if you have a pile of cash in the bank, you're going to just be a little bit more liberal with how you deploy it. If you're down to your, fumes, you're going to be extremely vigilant. And I think companies really should maintain that vigilant attitude at all times. That's investors' money. And the idea here is that and it should not be taken lightly, that when you take that money, there's an understanding that you're going to execute with that money. Yeah. And you're not just going to be throwing things against the wall. So there should be a very deliberate operating plan associated with those resources. I think because of the flow of funds, the investors themselves may have been a little lax in doing it because it was easier for them to write bigger checks than to do, because it's almost the same amount of work for a small deal and a large deal. So, if they're sitting on a lot of money that has to be put to work, it's easier for them. So, there may have been a little frothiness that crept into all of this. I guess, again, it's a question of when you have more, everyone loses a little bit of discipline. But notwithstanding that, there should absolutely be a plan and measured. I think what happens is when you lose discipline, you forget to ask or lose track of some of the real tenets, like for instance, differentiation. It's really critical, particularly in an evolving and fluid commercial landscape, that you need to have innovative targets for unmet patient needs. And you need to really be mindful of, the whole environment. And, as you approach those things, I think there's some fundamental questions that help inform resource allocation and priorities as well. What is the competitive effectiveness of the standard of care? Are you just going for a marginal improvement? Or are you looking for really a paradigm shift in terms of disease management? Is there a strategy for developing the value proposition? Is there a life cycle plan? Where do you see the opportunity to grow that? That's changed a little bit with the IRA, but it's still, you want to start to understand at least market opportunities, right? The size of the markets, before you could kind of take a small market approach and grow into it. So now the way you develop drugs changes as well, and you need to be smarter about the indications that you pick and really reflect on the timing and the pathway forward. So, those are questions that I'm not sure are always asked, and I would just illustrate, with over, at least I'm sure there's less now because of the capital casualties. But, at one point there were over 100 CAR T CD19 companies. How does that happen, right? Those questions obviously weren't being asked at the time. So, it's in some cases, these things were ill-fated situations to start with.
Differentiation. I want to pause there for a minute and get a little, just go a little more, a little deeper on that and get a little philosophical kind of perspective. Differentiation and your pursuit of it can be a scary thing because it forces you to face your truths. It forces you to look at the market, and it may force you, like in the case that you just described, it may force you to look at the market and say, boy, we're a me too. We're one of 130. Let's ask ourselves a hard question: do we move forward with this, or do we pivot? And that can be expensive. So I'm in the context of, right, a pivot can be expensive. Facing your truths and making changes can be expensive. So I guess in the context of seeking differentiation, what advice do you have around like how much to commit from a resource perspective to the pursuit of differentiation? Like, is that potentially an expensive endeavor? I know I'm talking in general terms and philosophically here, but anytime you gotta face a hard truth like that, you might be looking at a considerable business decision that costs money.
Yeah, I think you got to kind of delineate between the hypothesis and what needs to be done to kind of prove that hypothesis. It's easy to make claims, but then you got to try to figure out how do you run those right killer experiments early, because once you let the program progress, that's when you're really putting money out there. So it's really running the right animal models and understanding how they might translate, early on, run those killer experiments just to answer those very important scientific questions, as well as validate the thesis in terms of that level of differentiation. I also think that if you make a wrong turn and you keep going down the road, it's still a wrong turn. I think a lot of times people really need to consider killing programs early. I kind of view that addition by subtraction. People get emotionally attached to these things. They're concerned about the investment community. There's also a level of self-preservation involved, so, sometimes there's programs that I've observed that have no business being developed, but they continue for, the reasons I suggested.
Yeah. I'm interested in your perspective on the reality of cost and time, because this is another quote this guy threw at me. He said, new founders and CEOs don't understand that everything takes longer. Everything takes longer and costs more than advertised. 6 months and $600,000 will turn into 9 months and $750,000. He said that as if it's a fundamental truth that COOs and CFOs in the biopharma space should just subscribe to. If that's true, one, I mean, do you find that to be true? And two, if that's true, how does it affect your budgeting strategy?
I'd say in short that I find that things generally take longer and cost more. Mm-hmm. I think we find that in a lot of aspects. I wouldn't just say it's in biotech. Try to do a home improvement. It's going to hold you more and take longer. Yeah.
That's something I frequently have to explain to my wife, justify to my wife.
Exactly. So no different here. I think in terms of COVID, I think we've been finding opening sites, there's been a lack of resources. So opening sites, recruiting patients, it's been taken maybe a little bit longer than typical. But I think, so how do you manage that, right? If that's what reality is. And I think what you have to do is you have to consider that in your budgeting process, right? You need to make sure that you're just not financing yourself to the milestone. You got to give yourself a little bit more wiggle room to that, because otherwise you'll potentially come up short. And also on top of that, there's no such thing as necessarily just-in-time financing, particularly if you're a private company. You can't pivot as quickly. Public company, you have some advantages, but at the end, if the data doesn't go the way you want, you also don't want to be caught completely flat-footed. So, you need to kind of allow a cushion in your financing runway and in terms of how you tend to capitalize the company. I think there's a tendency, from what I've seen time and time again, is companies, I guess, always think they can do it with less money. And they seem to negotiate against themselves. And again, because of the cost of capital, I understand the mentality is you'd rather ask for 15 instead of 20. But if 20 is really the right number, or maybe 30 is really the right number, I think people have to rip the Band-Aid off and understand what they actually need with cushion. And that's what you go for. I think this marketplace, particularly for smaller companies that are long on aspiration and short on data, the cost of capital's gone very high, that they can only get small tranches of cash at a time. And that kind of like death of a thousand cuts. It's not necessarily an optimum way of capitalizing your company, but it's, I guess you got to take what's on the table.
Yeah. All right. Here's another thing he said. I'm real interested in your response to this one, because I know you're a CFO guy, but you're also a board guy. He said small or new companies without someone in the chief operations or chief financial role, or he said without someone good in a chief operations or chief financial role, are often sloppy with money because they turn to the board for financial guidance. He said boards oversee funds, they don't manage them.
No, it's an interesting point. The boards you can get into a situation where you have too many cooks in the kitchen. That's one observation. You really don't want to let the board in my opinion, to manage, right? It's oversight. Boards serve as an oversight function. We can provide guidance and direction. But, there's a fine line between board and management, and you don't want to necessarily get involved with the day-to-day activities. Boards approve budgets, boards approve strategic plans. So indirectly, the boards have oversight on resource allocation. But, it's really, at the end of the day, it's up to management to justify the expenditure in the business case and provide the recommendations for the board to review and challenge as appropriate and to be supportive. So, in terms of managing your resources, again, I think it starts with the development plan. It starts with the CEO in conjunction with the other functional heads. When you have a flatter organization like you're suggesting, or your colleague was suggesting, in terms of not having a COO or a CFO or somebody really involved with the operational execution, then, I think there's a risk of accountability as well, in terms of just operational execution. But it should be done as part of a plan. And I think in terms of the folks involved, I think you can effectively do it with fractional leadership initially. Again, it depends on the size of where you are in development. If you're a public, non-public company, there's other responsibilities. But, I have, as you know, I've effectively, at times, served as I'd say a fractional CFO. And I think that really speaks to the fact that a lot of companies need some adult supervision. They'd like to be able to build off of experiences of others, but they can't necessarily afford the cow. But there are opportunities to buy the steak, and they don't necessarily need the whole cow. But, I found that, by jumping into companies, it's been, I think, a lot of value added there, because people don't know what they don't know. And it kind of goes to the spirit of, the podcast itself. There's the business of biotech, right? You're trying to monetize these developmental activities and these science experiments. And a lot of times these companies are generally led by scientists who don't necessarily really have blind spots to the business side of things, whether it's business development, whether it's the operational execution. They can sniff out a good molecule, but, can they even develop it and bring it to the market and get reimbursement or position it, right? Develop it in the right way that, big pharma or the people who know how to monetize it, it'll resonate with them. Where I've seen as successful is people have been able to reverse engineer the drug development based on the needs of big companies. So I think, in short, you need good people around you. How you resource it is a different question.
Yeah. All right. One more hot take on some of this recent commentary I heard, and then we're going to jump into some fundamental advice for different phases of fundraising on the new and emerging journey. But speaking of adults in the room, this guy said, a detailed and realistic cash burn forecast is a powerful tool that goes a long way toward attracting new investors, but few new and emerging biotechs take the time to create one.
I think everyone should be doing it, in terms of the prevalence of people not having a cash forecast. I've never seen a company without a cash forecast, going back to your friend's observation. Sometimes it's garbage in, garbage out, right? Mm-hmm. It's only as good as the inputs at the end of the day. So, it might speak to the fact that sometimes these things are done in a vacuum. And, in terms of best practices, it can't be my forecast. It's got to be everyone's forecast at the end of the day. And it requires all the different functional inputs and considerations to make it a holistic forecast. And if that's not happening, you are going to have, it's going to be garbage in, garbage out. But what I would also say that's really, really fundamental relative to that is, because I think you do need to have a good forecast. You need to have visibility in terms of your cash burn. And I think there's a couple of other things that you need to consider and overlay with that. I think you need to understand what are your development catalysts, where are your milestones, and kind of overlay that. What I like to do is, as a visual, is I like to have on a graph, you have cash depicted on your vertical axis, and then you have the passage of time on your horizontal axis. Mm-hmm. And, and you can see how the cash runs down over time. And then what you do is an overlay on that. You look at your milestones. You look at what you anticipate, and you could see when you can potentially finance, and you could see what you might need to do differently to get to. And I think that really helps guide and inform your financing strategy around your development plan and your milestones. And then behind the milestones, you should really have some visibility in terms of what your accrual rates are, and how you're doing relative to those accrual rates to make sure your timelines hold. Because, I can pick a timeline out of the sky, but, if you're running a study, it's all about the patients.
For emerging biotechs, scaling the process development and manufacturing of biologic molecules to clinical standards can be challenging. However, you don't need to go it alone. Don't miss an episode of the Business of Biotech podcast, where we offer insights on regulatory, funding, and other essential topics. The pod is brought to you in collaboration with Cytiva, a global provider of technologies and services that advance and accelerate the development, manufacture, and delivery of therapeutics. Check out their resources at cytiva.com/emerging biotech. That's CYTIVA.com/emerging biotech. Yeah, I think those visuals, I mean, that's a great visual that you provide. It's a perfect illustration. And I think probably those visuals over time, you could probably like reach back into your memory banks and see a whole bunch of them, that you've been involved in over time. So that's where I kind of want to take the conversation next and maybe get some fundamentals, like I said, that are sort of based on the biopharma's continuum from discovery and development through clinical. So let's take for a minute a startup in a preclinical mode with a discovery that they want to take into development. They've secured a Series A. I don't know. Again, it's subjective in general. They've secured a Series A. Let's assume it's enough money that they feel like, we can do this. Let's talk about some fundamentals. Let's talk about, that could be $10 million for one company and it might have to be $100 billion for somebody else. But let's talk about some fundamentals in cash management for a company at that stage.
I guess I would take a step back and say, understand what is the objective of those proceeds, right? How did you size that deal? Did you just pass around a hat after you ran out of beer, or did you? Is there a plan associated with this that this is going to get you to IND? Is this going to get you? What are the investors' expectations? Because that sets you up. It's almost like reverse engineering. You have to kind of figure out, okay, what do I need to do to raise my next round of money? Mm-hmm. And then go about doing that. I think it's about that simple. And hopefully, when you decide the A round, you provided enough runway to get you to the next set of inflection points. And that's got to be the plan. So, with that said, I would make sure that I had a budget, a Gantt chart, and the tools in place to know that this is how we're measuring ourselves. And these are the steps along the way to ensure that we get there. It's kind of like establishing some guardrails. So you ensure that you don't go off the road and stay off of it too long.
Yeah. Who's involved in that? Like you said, establish some guardrails, sort of set up some rules. Who's typically involved in establishing those parameters?
It would be the folks involved with that stage of development. You'd want to look at what has to get done to get there. Mm-hmm. And I think you got to involve those folks. They must have had input along the way to get you there. And, now you just need to flesh out the plan a little bit. I guess another way of looking at it, I call them metrics. You can call them KPIs. What are we looking at? That's, it goes back to what are the questions that we're trying to answer? When are we going to get that? And I think one way, and there's different ways of doing it. I find one way that also kind of keeps people on the straight and narrow is correlating that to the, incentive pay as well. You take your strategic plan and, make people own portions of that. And the portions they own, that's part of their individual bonus target. And if they deliver, they get it. If they over deliver, they get better. Yeah. But I think you try to kind of correlate your operating and strategic activities with everyone else's activities.
Yeah. Is there any way to I don't know. I guess I'm grasping for a concept around how to assess the cost to achieve those or hit those milestones that will then set you up well for your next round of funding. Like I get all, theoretically and fundamentally, I get all that. And maybe the answer is, Matt, there's not. Like you got to figure it out as you go. But I'm trying to get my mind around like how do you assess, like, okay, we know how much money we have. We know the milestones we need to achieve over the next 6, 8, 12, 18 months, whatever it might be. Are there any standards or fundamentals or approaches or formulas that help you sort of assess what it's going to take from a cash management perspective or cash burn perspective to get from one to the next?
I think you should have a lot of that before you raise the money, because figuring that out after you've raised the money, that can be a problem if you really you didn't do it right? So I think that has to be kind of day one activity. I think then, what are the tools and the processes to kind of make sure, we talked about metrics, certainly in terms of cash management, cash spend, you have your budgets and you run your actual results against your budgets. And, if you're not spending, you're not executing. So you want to, see that that's working. Again, things take longer. And, what I like to do as a part of the process, because things take longer and more, is I like to have, at least on a quarterly basis, you do want to sit down with everybody and review how you do. And ideally, you can do it as part of your monthly management team, depending on your size of your company. But again, depending on your, monthly, quarterly. But what you do is what I've liked to adopt is a rolling forecasting process. So what you'd rather than doing a budget annually, and you can do the budget annually. I mean, it's part of, benchmarking and establishing yourself, but that like anything, it's static. And, once you move a day to month 2 in the year, the budgets are no longer necessarily reflective of what it is. And I think in terms of managing the business and particularly having a forward look on things, I find it's helpful to have a rolling forecast that you're constantly updating. Mm-hmm. So in some respects, your budget is always being reflective. You lock down the budget so you can measure how you performed. But as a management tool, a cash tool, I think the rolling forecast is really important to just see how you're doing. And it gives you a sense of what your cash is and what your projected expenses are relative to that.
Yep. All right, cool. Good sound advice there. Okay, let's roll into roll down the maturity continuum a little bit. Now the same company just landed a Series B. They did it right? Like they did it right. They got to a Series B that they're using to fund their foray into the clinic. And by the way, the fellow that I was telling you about earlier, the sky is falling kind of guy who's winding his company down. He also told me that clinical trials are the killer of emerging biotech. So in the context of that, right, like with that as our backdrop, this hypothetical company we're discussing is secured a Series B. It's ready to move into clinical trials. Looming in the back of everyone's mind is that this is where biotechs with the best intentions go to die. He said the clinical trials are the killer of new and emerging biotech, not so much because the science fails, but because they're so expensive. So there's that looming, daunting threat. How do we make sure that our Series B gets us where we want to go into clinicals?
It's funny because it's without, it's there's yin and yang with those clinical studies. Because, our business is creating clinical data, as you've heard me say before, in God we trust, in data we believe. Yeah. And I think in this environment, you're not talking about cash, data rules. You can raise money with cash that isn't as prohibitive as if you're raising without data. So you need the studies. To your friend's point, I think there's a lot that can be done in terms of improving clinical efficiency. Certainly for larger indications, when you're looking at the Alzheimer's and primary care type of indications, it's not for small biotechs for sure. But I think it's also important about being focused on how you're developing things. You need to manage the CROs as opposed to letting the CROs manage you. I think that's a common mistake that people make. And the CROs are like lawyers. The one thing these organizations can do is they can bill. They know how to bill really well.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting.
But so I think to his point, I think there's things you can manage, and I think you need to be a little bit more focused in terms of how you develop, with biomarkers. So, I think you can really shrink the size of your studies if you, and that doesn't require the same level of powering, if you can be a lot more focused in terms of the phenotypes that you're targeting.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting too. I want to get back to the managed CROs. Don't let them manage you point you made. What are some of the, I mean, obviously billing, like you said, service provision is like that's the best place to be if you're a accounts receivable associate. Keep you busy. But what are some best practices around making sure that you're not being manhandled by a CRO?
I think you certainly have to have somebody internally own the CRO and engage with them. A lot of people, I think, oh, I got the CRO doing it. It's kind of like manufacturing too, where you may have a little empathy, right? People think that, oh, I engage somebody to do my contract manufacturing, but they forget that they own it. It's their obligation, it's their liability, and it's their protocols. You can't just wash your hands of it. So, I think you need to hold them accountable. I think you need to have weekly meetings. You have to get in front of the change order management. What they like to do is constantly put change orders in front of you. And I think one thing that I've seen effective is a kind of a cost sharing. If you can kind of cap certain things, you give them more money if they do their job, as opposed to giving them more money when they're not doing their job.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting concept. I was reminded I had a doctor's appointment yesterday. Nothing serious, just some shoulder issues, right? And
I'll talk to you offline. I've got a lot of empathy for that.
Yes. I mean, hey, we're not getting any younger. It ended up being, entirely age related. But anyway, the point I was going to make is that relationship, like the doctor-patient relationship, the CRO, sponsor relationship, kind of reminds me of the doctor-patient relationship, where there's an expectation. At least I got the sense from, is a new doc. I hadn't seen him before, and I got the sense from him there was an expectation, that he was going to control the conversation, control the cadence of the conversation, control the information that was exchanged in the conversation, because that's the norm in that relationship for him. And, I went in with deeper, more voluminous questions that I think he was used to. And I kind of rocked, I guess I rocked the dynamic of that relationship a little bit for him in a positive way. It all ended well. But is that sort of what you're indicating? Like, is it on the sponsor's part? Is it their responsibility to go in there and be like, hey, I'm gonna turn the expectation of this relationship on its ear a little bit, because I need to express ownership and control to some degree of my candidate?
I don't think you have to worry about crossing swords with them or anything in that way. I think I find that, again, there's different types of people in these organizations. You have the A players, the B players, and C players. And, depending, you certainly learn very quickly where you rank in the organizational's eyes in terms of who they've assigned to your project. So, there's that element to be able to discern and understand who you're dealing with. And I think the important point is to understand that, you're the sponsor of the study. It's your study. You're going to live and die by the timing of the data. These guys don't have any skin in the game. They might as well be bureaucrats. Mm-hmm. So, I think trying to align the timing and the pace of things up front is helpful. But I think you have to ride these guys. And I think, people should consider having, research assistants and other people from the company side to kind of augment the study. Just again, to make sure that you're visiting the sites, that you're out there, and that you're just not relying on the CRO.
Yeah.
Among other considerations. But I think, again, you should understand what your costs are in advance. You shouldn't get burned. I mean, yes, I would just say that, the cost of drug development is expensive. This isn't for the faint of heart. and, it's capital intensive. And I find that a lot of times people are having a hard time with dilution, and I've never seen a company go out of business from dilution. And you need to make sure you have adequate cash resources too. And that's why you need to make sure you have enough to get you to your next inflection point.
Yeah.
And be willing to, it's funny, but the markets determine the price of things, and people don't like that. But when you go into a grocery store, the price of blueberries are what the price of blueberries are, and you generally pay whatever the going rate for blueberries are. So if you're raising money, if that's what the rate is for raising money for a company with your profile, then that's what the cost is. And lesson learns, every time you do things, you should certainly take a step back and say, what could have I done differently? And I'd say the shorter answer is you should raise money sooner than you anticipate. Because the longer you wait, it's only going to become more expensive. And I think people forget that when you think about dilution, you got to think about the cost of capital in the context of that.
Yeah. Very good. I'm curious about your, you and I've talked a little bit about the strategic aspect of portfolio management, in terms of, I guess, in the context of cash management and runway extension. So can you talk about that a little bit? Like when and where maybe is it appropriate, applicable, or in some cases perhaps begrudgingly necessary to play some portfolio management cards?
I think a little bit of it goes back to what we were saying earlier about going on a diet, right? You need to kind of manage your runway. And, if you're going to run a bunch of programs and you're going to run out of cash in the middle without any inflection points, you're really destroying value at that point. I think you need to, in certain points, decide, which child do you like better? Maybe it's just a matter of you send one kid to college this year and the other one is going to have to wait a little longer before he goes to college. He's going to have to work. So, there's some different ways of thinking about how fast you're driving your car, I think would be one. I think some of the questions that I raised earlier about, differentiation, how do your programs measure up against that? Is it competitive? Is it versus the standard of care, or is it going to be, is there a meaningful value proposition? What is the net present value of the market opportunities of these in today's IRA environment? And you can try to identify which one. Some of them may also impact in terms of your financing plan. Which one is closer to data? Which one can you get to that's de-risking? And then off of that, you can capitalize the company as well as be able to then send your other child to college.
It's a fitting analogy. I got one going. The first one's going to college in 18 days from today, in fact. So, yeah, thanks for raising my heart rate a little bit there, Allan.
I'm sorry for that, but it's good stuff, real good stuff. The other thing that we really didn't touch on that I think can help people is collaboration. Yes. I believe that the shortest distance between 2 points is a shortcut. And I think collaborations can be really great in that regard. And again, it kind of goes back to understanding who you are as a company, going to my earlier comments, because you need to kind of have a clear focus of what your needs and goals are, a deep understanding of how to leverage your core expertise, and then really understand where the gaps are in terms of what you need, what you can do to drive your programs, and where can that be added from someone else. It doesn't have to be done within all your four walls. And it can save time. It can save money. The money saved might even help send that second kid to college, or at least, community college.
Yeah.
So there's different ways to consider doing it. Also, if you're on a diet, you can't necessarily develop everything. You can by partnering with somebody, you can potentially get somebody else to validate one of your programs, one of your technology. If it's a platform that might be non-core, So by doing so, it provides you some additional capital, as well as validation, which is certainly helpful in this marketplace.
Yeah. Very good. Another session full of meaty nuggets of wisdom and insight from Allan Shaw. I appreciate it. What am I? Anything I'm missing here? I think this was a thoroughly covered discussion. But if there's anything else you wanted to share or other, concluding pithy nuggets of wisdom.
I would just say, collaborate whenever possible. Remember, core structure can be a lightning rod for self-inflicted wounds, and it needs to be proactively challenged. Innovation, as a general principle, should go well beyond the science and apply to all aspects of an organization's operations. And simply put, it's about working smarter and not harder and overcoming institutional bias. The bottom line, optimal deployment of organizational resources will inevitably become an important metric in navigating this turbulence and separating the winners from the losers.
Again, always good stuff coming from Allan. I appreciate it, man. This is a good talk. And we're looking forward to having you on next time. We'll do some brainstorming on our topic for next time. In fact, I throw this challenge out to our audience. You guys have heard from Allan just about monthly since we started this podcast. What do you want to hear next? Let me know. Matt.pillar@lifescienceconnect.com. Shoot me an email. Let me know what you want to hear from Allan on. And that's what we'll tackle next time we meet. Allan, I appreciate it. You have an amazing rest of your week. And I'm sure I'll talk to you again before summer's over, but you take care of yourself, and thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure. It was really great to see you, and always love talking about these things, and to be continued. Enjoy the rest of your summer, and see you soon.
Thanks. That's advisor to the biotech stars and Portage Biotech CFO, Allan Shaw. I'm Matt Pillar, and this is the Business of Biotech. We're produced by Bioprocess Online with the support of Cytiva, which demonstrates its support to new and emerging biopharma companies at cytiva.com/emerging biotech. If you like listening in on conversations with the best in the business, subscribe to the Business of Biotech. Sign up for our newsletter at bioprocessonline.com/BOB. And also be sure to leave us a review. Let us know how we're doing. And thanks for listening.